and welcome to the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zachary Elwood. This is a podcast aimed at improving understanding of human behavior. You can learn more about it at peoplewhoreadpeople.com. As you might know, I work on reducing toxic political polarization. I've been working full-time on this problem for the past 9 months or so, and part-time on it for years before that. I recently released a book aimed at a liberal audience about the problem of polarization. It's titled How Contempt Destroys Democracy, with the subtitle An American Liberal's Guide to Toxic Polarization. A Kirkus Reviews review said that it makes, quote, compelling arguments based on astute observations and backed by solid research, end quote. As you probably know, there are a lot of objections to this work, a lot of skepticism about this work. I and others doing this work are regularly insulted by both conservatives and liberals. I regularly see pessimistic and pretty paranoid messages where people think that I and others in this space are secretly working for the, quote, other side, or that I and others in this space have a secret liberal or conservative agenda. More commonly, people just call us stupid and naive. Many of the objections and skepticisms are based on misunderstandings of various sorts. Misunderstandings about what the other side really wants and what they're like. Misunderstandings about what the goals of reducing toxic polarization really are, and more. In my book, I have a section toward the beginning that talks about common objections. I'll read a little bit from that section. Objection number 1, the word polarization implies a both sides problem, but liberals don't contribute to this problem in a significant way. Our problem is simply that the other side has become so wrong and dangerous. Objection number 2, it's morally correct to be polarized when you're fighting bad, dangerous people. For example, like Trump. Objection number 3, trying to reduce people's animosity at Trump and Trump voters helps Trumpism. We need our animosity to defeat them. Objection number 4, if you're trying to reduce polarization, you're wrongly and naively valuing civility and unity more than morality and justice. These objections are phrased in liberal-leaning language, but there are similar objections from the right. They use different language and terms, but the underlying objection is the same. The core underlying objection being they're bad and we're good, so it's naive to ask us to reduce our animosity toward them. And I do understand these objections. Before I got into this work, I would have had a lot of the same kinds of objections. Trump is just so bad, my thinking would have gone. So we need to shame these people and make them see the light of day. Or I might have thought that people seeking to reduce animosity did have some secret underhanded agenda. These are stressful times, so I do get the objections and why rational people have them. It's my hope that people who are skeptical about this work are willing to listen to resources like this, or similar ones, like my book. No matter your political views, we could probably agree that America is in a tough spot right now with our divides. It's a situation that I think requires more people to carefully consider this situation, how we got here and how we might get out. If you appreciate this episode, I hope you share it with others who may have some of the objections addressed. One of the big themes in my polarization books is that it's very important that we spread the word throughout society and help overcome all these various objections to the work that people have in their minds. So sharing this talk is one easy way you can help with that. This is a talk that I had with Vanessa Otero for her audience. Vanessa is the founder of Ad Fontes Media, which is a media bias analysis company. You can learn more about it at adfontesmedia.com. That's ADFONTES media. You may have seen her media bias charts making the rounds. She's gotten a lot of respect for that work. If you're curious about that work, I interviewed her for my podcast a few months ago. We talked about her interest in reducing polarization and how she saw her media bias analysis as relating to that goal. I think Vanessa asks some very good questions and structures the talk very well. I think it's the best talk I've given on this topic, which is why I put it on the homepage of my polarization website, american-anger.com. I also want to say if you're listening to this on audio, this talk was done via a video call. So if you want to see that, you can find it on the People Who Read People YouTube channel. Okay, here's the talk I had with Vanessa Otero.
Welcome and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to have Zachary Elwood here with me today. You know, Zachary is a uh, really thoughtful and wise writer about the issue of polarization. And those of you who saw our email to register for this, which is all of you, have seen the images of his books, Diffusing American Anger, and his most recent one, How Contempt Destroys Democracy. And the reason I was so drawn to Zachary's books is because there's just so many overlaps between what we do at Ad Fontes Media and the way that Zachary approaches the concept of polarization. So I want to jump right into the good stuff. I want to talk about objections.
Mm.
Objections to even framing the issues that we face in our country politically as an issue of polarization. Because I've run into this so much with promoting our work at Ad Fontes as one of the reasons we put out the media bias chart is so folks can see how different other sides' media is for the purposes of understanding others' media consumption and for purposes of understanding why we're so polarized. But the thing I always get as a response is, well, it's not that we're polarized. That's not the problem. The problem is that the other side is just wrong. And if they would just like simply be right and agree with me, we wouldn't we wouldn't be so polarized.
All right.
I know you get that a lot yourself. What do you say to folks who frame that objection that way?
Yeah, and first I just wanted to throw in thanks so much for having me on. It's a big honor, and I'm always humbled when people want to talk to me about it because I haven't been in this space that long, and I mainly see my efforts as trying to draw attention to other people's ideas and research and stuff in a more accessible and easy to understand way. So it always means a lot when people think I did a good job. So thanks for that. Yeah, the objections, there's quite a few objections, but yeah, I think the core objection kind of boils down to that. The other side is just bad, right? And there's various forms of that can take on the right and the left. Like it can be phrased in different ways. But I think that what it misses, I think the core thing it misses is just is what Daniel Stone called our undue hate. It's our exaggerated ideas and worst case interpretations of what drives the other side, our political opponents. It's the worst case interpretations of so many things they do, and often it's just not seeing that what drives them largely is like the fear of the more extreme people on our side, these kinds of things. So I think it boils down to the exaggerated fear and contempt and animosity that we have for each other, and seeing that we can vehemently, strongly disagree with each other without bringing in all of this contempt and overstated contempt and fear and such. And when those things enter the equation, they drive the conflict cycle and end up creating the very things that we're scared of and upset by, right? And that's what I focus on a lot, is the way that those negative emotions about each other aren't just about emotions, that those things actually skew people's beliefs and help create the more extreme and divisive and hardened and non-negotiable stances that people have, because a lot of that stuff is driven by, fear and anger and animosity and such.
I find that when I invite folks to uh, create a greater understanding of folks on the other side, that's viewed as sometimes a non-starter. And often I posted a couple weeks ago on LinkedIn. Uh, there was I don't even remember what big political event it was, but Trump was convicted of 34 felonies. Big news story. Everybody's covering it. And I invited folks to watch, take 30 minutes, an hour, if they could stand it, to watch the cable news from the side they disagree with most.
Mhm.
And for the purposes of understanding that other people's media consumption is really different. And I got a lot of like visceral, like, no, I'm not going to do that. And it seemed to come from a couple of things. One, fear that um, fear that I was trying to encourage them to adopt the other side's views. There was a lot of resistance to that.
Mhm.
And so what you talk about, like being afraid of like having a lot of contempt for the other side and like just being like so resistant to that, I think that's one aspect of it. But two,
Mhm.
people didn't realize I was asking them not to change their opinions. I was asking them to view it just merely to understand
Right.
what other people are viewing.
Mhm.
Uh, and the resistance to it. So I was not saying, please abandon all your beliefs and like believe somebody else's beliefs. But people
Yeah.
thought that I was asking them that.
Yeah.
So
I was
get
gonna,
into
yeah,
that
whenever
about that
you're,
kind of
yeah.
contempt. Please do.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of this thing. It's like because we have a hard time distinguishing between a call to understand and empathize with other people and agree with those people, right? Like so often in my books, I'm making cases for how you can understand someone else's view and see the better versions of it. And that can, I think so often we easily conflate that as like I'm defending that view or I have that view.
Hmm.
But, for so many things we could go through, it's like I understand, I feel like I understand by and large what drives a lot of the narratives on both sides of the political aisle. It doesn't mean I agree with, any particular stance necessarily. It just means I think there's an important thing there about trying our best to understand those better points and not as opposed to so often our instinct is, when we're in conflict is to assume the worst about everything that
Hmm.
happens, right? Any rhetoric or any behavior conflict makes us jump to the worst interpretations. And I think we need more people to try to understand the better reasons, what they call the steel man kind of things. I think a lot of those
Yeah,
times
why?
those things are pretty banal and easy to understand if we try. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
why is it important to understand other people's like you said steel man as opposed to the like straw man? Like talk about what this for those who might not be familiar, like what's a steel man kind of argument?
yeah. The steel man and the straw man thing. The steel man refers to thinking about the strongest versions of our opponent's arguments versus the straw man is the weakest versions or the often in practice it's just the most pessimistic versions of what the other side thinks. But I think yeah, for people who say why is that important, right? Like why if I'm still going to end up disagreeing with them, why is it important? And I think it's important for the reasons just stated because if we see the kind of the deranging nature of toxic conflict and how it makes people it drives people to more extreme and more divisive behaviors. It creates support for more divisive and more extreme and non-negotiable leaders and ideas. If we can see that, then we can see the value of trying to engage for our own sake, even for our own political goals' sake, for trying to engage in more respectful and more honest and true ways, as opposed to the more pessimistic and worst case possible imagining ways of engaging. So I think, and that's another thing I emphasize in my book because I'm trying to make an argument to politically passionate people for why they should want to embrace these ideas, which I think is hugely important for getting, as many of us are politically passionate people, for getting people to embrace these ideas even for their own sake and not just for, the sake of being nice or something, right? Yeah.
Right. Let's dive into that. That relates to one of the questions that we have. So the last part of the question is liberals need to agree that the conservative side is right. It's a conservative invitation. It challenges the next revolution will be bloodless if the liberals allow it. That's I think paraphrased from something that Kevin Roberts, the chairman, the leader of Heritage Foundation, said on an interview in reference to Project 2025. Um, do liberals need to agree that the conservative side is right? Is that what you're calling for?
No, not at all. No, that's not what I or anyone else in this space is calling for. It's
Or conversely, that conservatives need to agree that liberals are right?
no, yeah. See, that is a common misunderstanding. Yeah, but I think it's related to the idea. I guess it's related to the misunderstanding of what this work is about, and there's so many misunderstandings about this work. And I think, you know, for example, an organization starts with us that I work with. You know, we often see the criticism, oh, you're working with the other side, right? You're with the bad guys. Like we get that
Hmm.
from people on the
Hmm.
left and the right, which I think
Hmm.
is kind of the fundamental nature of what conflict does to us. Any conflict, people trying to resolve the conflict are seen
Hmm.
as, you know, the enemy or traitors or what have you.
Hmm.
And it's just I would say it's just a fundamental misunderstanding because, you know, like I said, we're trying to get people not to avoid disagreement. You know, there's going to be strong disagreement, even strong moral judgment, even anger. Like there's nothing wrong
Hmm.
with anger, but it's
Hmm.
examining, it's being willing to examine what really drives the people, you know, your political opponents. It doesn't mean you can't judge specific leaders or specific people on the other side who
Hmm.
you see as divisive, as extreme, whatever it may be. But it's trying to understand what drives the support for those people. Or if you
Hmm.
see, you know, if you think the
Hmm.
people on the other side are supporting more extreme people, it's being curious about what are the underlying dynamics of the conflict. And I think, you know, obviously these things are really hard to talk about in an off the cuff way. Uh, but that's the things that I and other people try to get across in our work is seeing the underlying pieces of the conflict and how that bubbles up to more
Hmm.
extreme people, statements, behaviors, and what have you. And then if you can see how that dynamic works, then you'd be interested in tamping down the unnecessary and unreasonable amounts of contempt and fear and these kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk really specifically about contempt. And you talk early in your book about how contempt and anger are are different things. So it's you didn't say contempt and anger. It's not like you can be angry
Mhm.
and you can disagree about a position, like really strongly and want to convince somebody about the like why you disagree and why you're correct, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
But contempt, how contempt destroys democracy. It's about contempt being a thing that undermines you trying to achieve your aims.
Mhm.
And uh, there's so many places we can go with this, but let's move to a concept that you spend a good amount of time on in your book. You've alluded to it a little bit already, but outgroup homogeneity.
Yeah,
What
that's
is
actually,
it?
yeah, that's what I was thinking of
And
when you asked that question because, you know, it's like I'm angry a lot. Like a lot many people are angry about specific things a lot, right? And I might be angry at, you know, things Trump has done or angry at various things, but I think it's very important to distinguish between our feelings, our views of specific people, say it's Trump, Biden, whoever, and our views of our fellow citizens who are willing to support those people or those ideas or whatever. Because, you know, even though I'm very open that I think Trump is a bad, even dangerous leader, but that doesn't, that I can still understand what drives rational and good people to support him. Like that is a key distinction, but I think your point about the outgroup homogeneity thing. So the outgroup homogeneity effect is in research when they show that in conflict or in a situation where there's an in-group and an out-group, we have the tendency to view the out-group as basically being all the same as you know, which means in practice we often view them as being like their worst members, right? And you can find examples like this all over social media very easily. You open up Twitter, you'll see it. It's like all Republicans are, racist and fascist and authoritarian. All liberals are, want to, kill babies after birth or whatever the
Antifa,
extreme
communists.
Antifa,
Yeah.
communists, what have you,
Hmm.
groomers, what have you.
Hmm.
So there's just this tendency to see the other side as in simplistic ways, at the same time seeing our own group as very complex and human and often like much more divided than the other group, which seems like a monolith, right?
Hmm.
Which makes the other side even more scary because we see them like everything they do is like connecting to other things, and it's this huge scary group, right?
You bring up some quotes in your book, uh, from both Democrats and Republicans saying, if we could, Democrats saying, oh, if we could only get our stuff together like the Republicans, where they just agree with each other and they're all in lockstep. And then basically Republicans saying the exact same thing about Democrats.
Right, yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon too. Like when I first encountered that, I was surprised because of this Republican pundit told me behind the scenes, off the record, she's like, the Democrats are just so aligned, the liberals are so aligned. I just wish we could be like them. And other people, when I shared that with liberal people, they're like, what is she talking about? It's obviously the reverse, right? But that's what the out-group homogeneity effect and similar group dynamics do to us.
Hmm.
They make the other side seem this completely aligned monolith who's
Hmm.
all trying to accomplish the same
Hmm.
thing. But to get back to your point, it's like we need to. I think it's important to distinguish uh, our anger at certain people or ideas we think are wrong or harmful from our understanding of why people are willing to support those ideas. And those can be quite different. For
Hmm.
example, like some people vote for Trump just because they may not even like him. They may even think he's quite bad, but they see it as a lesser of two evil things, and they're scared of what they see as extreme or dangerous behaviors on the left. And so, the group of Trump voters or the group of Biden voters are not monolithic. There's all different reasons, a spectrum of different concerns and reasons. Sometimes it's just one issue. Like some people are just one issue voters and they're like, I'm just voting because I believe X on this very important issue, right? So I think it's important to see that nuance about groups in
Hmm.
general, about our own group, about another group, and I think that helps explain the distinction between yeah, anger and contempt too, because contempt really plays a role when it is applied to an entire large
Hmm.
swath of people, right?
Yeah,
That's when it really becomes dangerous. Like it's one thing to have anger or contempt for like a few specific people or something, but it really
leaders.
becomes toxic when it spreads to whole entire groups, and then it impacts how politicians and pundits and journalists or whoever talk about these things, and they
Hmm.
create more in group between group animosity in the way they talk, and so on and so on.
The folks that are on this webinar are familiar with Ad Fontes Media and should have quite a bit of familiarity with distinguishing levels of things. I mean, on our very chart itself, it's, skews left and right, strong left and right, hyperpartisan left and right, most extreme. It's not just, one side is all one thing and one side is all another thing, but we do that a lot with the outgroup homogeneity effect. And it's really exacerbated in our entrenched two-party political system as polarization has grown. Because, as you mentioned, our our distribution of how people, the kind of beliefs people hold in the United States is sorry, I'm conscious of my like hands and the blurriness here. It's bimodal, like left and right. There's a lot of folks that will in that middle, if you just think about the chart, like that line between like strong left and hyperpartisan left and strong right and hyperpartisan right. There are a lot of folks that hold those views. And then in the middle, it's not like I don't think it's another mode. I don't think it's another spike, but I think it's like there's a big group here. It's not all the way down. But it's not like, there's zero people that are in the middle. I don't
Mm.
think there's a ton of people right in the middle, but I think there's like if you
Right,
added up all
there's
these people right here,
diverging. Yeah.
yeah, it would be like a fairly large like mound in the middle.
Mm.
But you only like if you're most people are not dead in the middle on a lot of issues because there isn't necessarily a flat middle on issues, with like guns or abortion. Like tending to land just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right is common, as is landing strongly to the left and strongly to the right. So like if you're landing on closer to one side than the other, because we're so polarized, like the if you're on the right, you're closer to Trump. If you're on the left, you're closer to Biden. And you don't have like a middle choice in the United States. Your vote is like one
Mm,
or the
mhm,
other, essentially.
mhm.
And people will ascribe like it's really rough for people who feel like they have nuanced views, and then they get categorized in that outgroup homogeneity effect. Like if they just
Right.
lean a little left or lean a little right, and they're if they lean a little right and they're called, or even if they're strong right and are called, racist, fascist, destroyers of democracy, or Antifa, communist, groomers, then like that's clearly incorrect.
Mhm.
They can't believe the other side because they know that to not be true of themselves.
And it drives them farther into that path of polarization,
Yes.
right? On both sides, when it is understandably
Yeah.
angering to be told what you believe, and that what based on things that you don't think are applicable, to be told you are XYZ.
Hmm.
It can just be very deranging in ways that I think I think we're only in the beginning stage of understanding how deranging these various insults that are thrown around can be. I think we'll look back one day and have a better understanding of just how much. Yeah, and there's plenty of research showing, how insults. There's like one study from back in the 60s maybe that was like, insulting people has a boomerang effect of, making you double down on the things you're being insulted for, and these kinds of things. There's just all this human psychology at work
Hmm.
that drives us deeper into channels. Yeah.
Hmm. That so talk about that vicious cycle of more contempt leading causing the very problem that you are fighting against.
Yeah, that was a big thing I wanted to focus on for the book, because I think it helps make a scalable argument to people, no matter their political views, of why they should care about these things. And many people have written about the cycle of conflict, how it's well, one person, can't remember his name offhand, but he wrote about the mutual radicalization process of conflict. Right, it creates both sides become increasingly fearful of each other, and the actions that one group may make in defensive ways to what they see as defensive ways to the other side becomes is perceived as the provocations and aggressions to the other side, and vice versa. So things just keep going in this vicious cycle. And I think the thing that's important there is our our emotions, our fear and our anger can distort our beliefs, right? Like, for example, no matter what you believe about election distrust or election denial, I think everybody would agree toxic polarization leads to more and more people distrusting elections. And no matter if you think, one side is worse than the other, what have you, it's just it's a natural progression to uh, find reasons to say like that election is unfair, and that's an outcome of high suspicion, high anger, et cetera, et cetera. And again, even if we think specific people have done bad things on that front, like it's the underlying dynamic is there, the emotions are there, and so that's just an example of how our our emotions can really derange our thinking on all sorts of things, on issues, on just stances on specific events, stances on issues. Another factor there's so many factors there, but I think one factor is when we see the bad guys as believing something, nobody wants to be like the bad guys, so we kind of subconsciously can find our stances shifting in an opposite direction. It's like, well, if Trump voters believe this, then I'm gonna I don't want to be like them, and I want to make a stand against that. So maybe my beliefs will shift a little bit more to the left, and vice versa on the other side. That's just there's all these various psychological reasons why we can find ourselves kind of like drifting to the edges on stances,
Mhm.
and so that's why I think it's important to notice that the more contemptuously we engage with each other, we're contributing to that dynamic. And if we, and it's entirely possible, like I emphasize in my book, to politically passionate people, it's entirely possible to embrace these ideas while pursuing, whatever political goals you want. And I would actually say embracing these ideas actually helps you because it means you're trying to speak in more persuasive ways that speak to a broader range of people. You're not alienating people. So I think it's very important to see that these are not, I think a lot of people's instinct about this work is that political passion or political activism is mutually exclusive with depolarization ideas. And I think that's just completely wrong. Like to me, those two things are aligned and even help, I think depolarization ideas help political persuasion and political activism. But that's I think our instincts when in conflict lead us to see that as completely opposed, right? Because we feel like, well, we have to make our contempt known, like that's how we'll beat the bad guys, right? But in my mind, and in many people's mind, that's actually what creates the very pushback you're working against, because nobody wants to be told they're pieces of shit, basically. So
Yeah.
it helps build the cycle of conflict.
Yeah. I mean, we've uh we danced around the subject a little bit around language, around like calling people certain names, but it's a really key component about persuasion and contempt. Uh, when there, I view it as a hierarchy of there's like a hierarchy of verbal persuasion. Like ideally, you'd be use lots of facts to, if you're going to make an argument, you use as many facts as possible to make that argument, your conclusion that you're supporting, really strong. You can use the fewer facts you use and the more conclusions you use, the more the more easily it's categorized as opinion. But on our very chart, there's a line between, there's like a couple of sections. There's the opinion section, okay, and above that is an analysis section, and above that is fact reporting sections. And like the difference between that fact reporting, analysis, and opinion is truly the density of facts to conclusions. But then there's like this line, and below that, it's it's, we call it our problematic section, but it contains a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons that things are not merely opinion, they're problematic. But the biggest thing is dehumanization, insult, and vilifying language. And I really want to dive into those distinctions because, like, what we mean by dehumanizing language is language that that specifically calls out somebody for being not human, like they're animals, they're monsters, they're less than human, they're aliens. The Like they're not even people. Insults, it's a little bit more straightforward. Vilifying, like words that have vil, like VIL, is a root word, like they're evil or they're villains. Those particular words are really strong, and they're on the lower end of the persuasion hierarchy. But people use them for a couple of reasons. One is like it's easier, it's just easier to name call than to like make a really factually supported argument, especially in 240 characters. And people get a lot of like pats on the back and engagement and thumbs up from their side for like
Yeah,
calling people, the orange Satan or something. Like I literally got that in an email
a lot of
when I was
incentives.
promoting this webinar.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a
talk
lot of
about
yeah. There's
contempt, like how that plays a role.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It's like there's so many of these things as I read out in the books. There's so many of these things that just have this kind of self-reinforcing aspect, and it's like the more polarized a society becomes, the more incentives there are to be polarizing, right? Like the more polarized a society becomes, the more power is granted to more polarizing people and polarizing language. And I think that's part of seeing the need to tone down the contempt too, is because the system is such that it rewards more polarizing behavior. But yeah, I think there's so many. I had a good interview on my podcast with Karina Kurostalina, who wrote a book about the role of insults in political, international, national conflicts and such. And that was a good talk. And one of her points, or one of the things that stood out to me about that talk was, I'm a big believer in that the internet and social media is a big amplifier of these things, because you think about the internet, the internet is a place where it's easy to store and retrieve all sorts of insults. Like there's insults everywhere. It's easy to make insults. It's easy to have our insults viewed, right? It's just you can think of the internet as like basically an insult creation and amplification place, and like all the insults from the past don't fade from our memory. They're all there for us to dredge up at a moment's notice, right? So I'm a big believer in that, and yeah, I think when it comes to the dehumanizing language, I think often there's these shades of it too. Like there's some less direct things. Like for example, I was thinking today about the whole like real Americans kind of language on the right. Like that's an indirectly dehumanizing thing because you're basically saying, well, you're not real Americans. You're almost like not real people because you don't believe what we believe, right? And that's just one example. I could pull other. You see it, lots of things on the left and the right, and I think there's all these shades of things that are, I think we often think of dehumanizing as like literally like saying you're not human, or you're a cockroach or whatever. But it's like there's all these shades of things that are insulting up to dehumanizing, and I think that all plays a role. Which including, I would say, I actually wanted to write a piece about this where there's another way we can be dehumanizing or at least insulting is treating others' narratives as if in the worst possible way, as if as if saying the reason you vote for Trump is for the worst possible reasons. Like that is if not dehumanizing, is a very insulting and demeaning thing, depending on how it's phrased. But just to say, when we disrespect each other's narratives and treat their narratives as basically entirely malicious or entirely founded on horrible things, that is that can have a very very insulting and understandably anger producing reaction.
Yeah, an example you talk about in your book is saying, the reason Trump voters vote for Trump is because they're racist. Now, that's and you gave a counterexample of like, here's examples of other reasons like folks would vote for Trump. Can you talk about that example?
Yeah, I think yeah, well, I mean, one key way to see that it's not just about racism, if anyone needs to hear that, is those kind of narratives don't help explain why racial minority support for Trump has increased substantially, between 2016 and 2020. And if anybody wants to look into that, I wrote about it in my book, of course, but Musa Al-Gharbi has a great paper called Race and the Race for the White House, which really kind of breaks down some of those most pessimistic narratives on that front, or most pessimistic interpretations of research and those kinds of things. But maybe you had mentioned a specific example. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if I.
Yeah, you talked about doesn't account for somebody who just maybe like a low
Oh, right.
engagement, a information voter, maybe a younger voter who's hasn't really given a lot of thought to about the history of racism in our country or whatever.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So I think the nature of conflict makes many people reach for these really elaborate, as I see them, explanations that delve into the past to help explain,
Hmm.
why racism or segregation or whatever it may be played a role in forming the bad ideas of Republicans, or on the left, some conservatives will paint these elaborate pictures about the dark Marxist underpinnings of far left thought and such. And the thing is, like, we're such good storytellers. Humans are just such good storytellers. We can easily create these very convincing and persuasive arguments about the long history of the badness of our opponents, right? And
Hmm.
their creeping, inclinations or malicious motives, and tie it into past things. But at the end of the day, the nature of polarization and conflict is like, if you could easily place someone down in the middle of that polarized situation who knew nothing about any of that past stuff, and they would be like, oh, well, I see arguments and for why this makes more sense, or I'm more afraid of these things over here, and they would start to go on one polarized track or another, right? Like
Hmm.
it doesn't require a lot of these elaborate, which I find are often just our ways in practice of of trying to build excuses for why the other side is so bad. It makes us, we're drawn to those narratives because it makes us feel like we understand their badness, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes we're just fooling ourselves because it is tempting for us to feel like we understand this huge complex thing and we understand the bad guys, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
we're just drawn to very simplistic narratives that make us feel good and make us feel superior in our contempt and such.
Yeah. That's excellent. I feel bad there. I'm letting all these questions build up, and people have a lot of questions. Thank you for your engagement. We're only going to take the questions through the Q&A. We're not going to. So if you've got your hand raised, please type in your question in the Q&A. We have a couple related questions, so I'll read the first one that addresses this. How do I talk with someone who holds me and my views in contempt?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously a tough one because I think at some level you have to question whether that's even worth it. Like if someone's engaging with you in that way, but then sometimes you have to, right? You feel like you have to in some situations, and I think you know I, I I have a few thoughts on that in the book at the very end, but I think one of the things that stands out to me is especially if your conversation is being viewed by other people, say it's on social media or say it's in a public context where say you're a politician interacting with someone who you feel is contemptuous towards you. I think it's very important to keep in mind the other people that are listening and observing that because I think what the dynamic that often happens is people get stuck in this mutual insult back and forth, which just has if we're talking about publicly viewed things, it just has the impact of driving away the people, further polarizing the people that are watching because they're just going to filter for the insulting
Mm-hmm.
things that they find in that interaction, right? That
Mm-hmm.
offend them and their group. So I think it's very important to keep in mind how can I talk in a persuasive way, not necessarily to this person who's disrespecting me or treating me with contempt, but how can I speak in ways that are persuasive to
Mm-hmm.
people that may be listening that may actually care to be reached or care to have a more nuanced view or have their minds shifted. So I think that's, and I think otherwise, if it's a private conversation, you'd probably just be best to walk away. But I think about that in terms of like all of these online and public interactions that happen where, someone's saying, they're treating me with contempt. I'm going to return fire with
Mm-hmm.
fire. And I just think
Mm-hmm.
that's often just falling into the trap of,
Mm-hmm.
the hate bait kind of trap where we just get caught. And then
Mm-hmm.
the animosity becomes the focus as opposed to talking
Mm-hmm.
about the actual issues. And I
Mm-hmm.
will say also, I've interacted, I've done my fair share of going into very polarized places like really angry pro-Trump groups, for example, where I had some pretty nuanced conversations just by refusing to return fire with fire and being
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable too, and being like, hey, I mean, you made a good point there, for X, Y, Z, but here's why I think what I think. And I've even had people apologize where they were like, sorry, I came off so, mean at first, but I've been having a tough time in my life. I mean, that kind of stuff happens, especially online, where online, I think we're often like talking to people who we don't know what they're going through, and their online interactions bring out the worst in people and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I just think, it's a very tough thing to do, obviously, but I think
Mm-hmm.
taking the patient or, the more neutral approach and vulnerable approach often is the stronger. It's a harder thing, but I think it takes strength, and I think it pays off a lot of times. Yeah.
I have the exact same experience. Is refusing to insult, refusing to like go to that level, and even refusing to like respond to the anger. It's tough, like
Hmm.
especially when you like identify a disagreement. But when you look at and we're sort of primed to like when somebody responds to us on social media, you're like, what are they saying against me?
Yeah.
And you sort of view it as like a an attack or something you have to rebut, but it's not always. Sometimes it's a legitimate point. Then if you can slow down and listen to it and then refuse to, it's harder when somebody starts out with an insult,
Yeah.
or some anger or some contempt towards you, but it really does diffuse it when you say, okay, yeah, I hear that you repeat back their concern and like explain it like using your own words, non-insulting words, and it really it tones down the rhetoric. I had a great exchange. I do this all the time on social media, and I know you do it all the time on social media. I see it. The tough part is it's you don't get as many pats on the back from people who agree with you than you do if
Definitely
you're
not.
like doubling down on the insults. Like that gets a lot more engagement. It is,
Yeah.
and social media just wires us to be like, ooh, if I say this thing and like a bunch of people like it, that means it's right. I kind of like to go into the echo chamber, like threads where people are like, yeah, high five, I agree with you, and I'm like, actually, this is this is harmful. I thought,
I used to get so many more shares when I would put out, really good zingers at people, but I don't really do that anymore.
yeah. Well, yeah. So I wanted you to share about that. Like, how did you were you weren't always the high-minded, above insults, personality on social
Yeah.
media that you are today. Tell us about, pre-2016.
Yeah, don't go through my old tweets, please. You'll find some doozies. But yeah, I talk about that in the book about in the books about how my path of like when Trump got elected, I was insulting Trump voters, and putting all these righteous screeds online. Then I started getting curious about conflict dynamics and started thinking like, maybe I'm part of the problem. And then that got me curious about like, well, what are the narratives, the angry narratives that people on both sides have, and how did they form, and how did polarization increase over the last few decades? And so yeah, that was kind of my journey into it. And yeah, and I even had the instances of driving away. Insulting and driving away people I knew that I was close to, and these kind of things.
Yeah. Um, let's pick away at some of these questions. We got just so many great ones. Thank you all. Do you think that extreme polarization causes less politically engaged citizens, more or less in the middle, to further separate themselves from the process?
I think it's complex. I think it results in some people tuning out because they're tired, they're exhausted. Some people have called it an exhausted mindset of being exhausted with the fighting and the animosity, and especially for people that don't align as much on, can identify as much with a left or right label, which I think there's a lot of people. The increasing polarization can make people tune out and just not care, which I think is also, for politically passionate people, that's another reason you should not like high contempt and toxic polarization, because it does make a lot of people tune out and makes them less susceptible to listen to your stances on things you care about. But I'd also say, obviously at the same time, it creates a lot of people who are hyper tuned in, right? Like, and I think, and I agreed with Ezra Klein's synopsis at the end of his book, where we pay way too much attention to things we can't control, like national politics. Where like it's almost like creating a magnifying glass of everyone's attention, focusing on these things that they can't change and can't really affect, and that they're really angry about also. And I think that helps explain a lot of the kind of impotent rage a lot of people feel on such things. And I liked his recommendation of focusing on more local issues, things you can actually change, things you're
Hmm.
passionate about, and also
Hmm.
just questioning, like, I feel like a lot of us, especially the more online people, spend a lot of time just venting online, like how many hours are people spending on those things, and are the, I feel like a lot of people think that that's actually accomplishing something, but I think we should question, like, is that accomplishing something, or is that a lot of that stuff just building the contempt and animosity, like,
Hmm.
and helping create some of the dynamics that we're upset by. So I think it's helpful to question how we spend our time, and consider,
Hmm.
if I am passionate, if I am angry about things, can I devote my time and effort to something that's like more constructive and useful, like in my community or something like that.
Hmm.
Things that I can actually feel good about, and feel good that I've actually am actually doing something concrete. Yeah.
Yeah, like civic engagement, especially on the like local politics level, or even engaging with people like one to one. Um, I have a few questions about uh, one of the topics, which is, you allude to a difference between like online conversations and in-person conversations, and I think there's approaching those requires different sets. There's like different circumstances that attend each one of them and different approaches that can work. We spend so much of our time at Adfontes with our analysts, like left, right, and center, like in pods with each other, rating articles. So each of them will spend 2 hours at a time with people from their political opposites, like discussing political things, and they can do so without contempt. Not just because of training and like practice and like an internal commitment to it, which are really
Not just because
important.
they're getting paid. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have folks like, whenever we put out a call for analyst jobs, we get a lot of applications. It's truly fun. And we do feel like we're doing something, it's very, I
Yeah.
was really frustrated before I had this company trying to like have a conversation online with people on Facebook. I'm having this one conversation. It is so much work to get somebody to like, tamp down the level, like get them to agree on like some facts, and then like have a persuasive argument. And like, meanwhile, millions of memes are just floating around. I'm like,
Yeah.
what difference I'm making? It was very
Right.
frustrating. And
Yeah.
so like when you feel like you are actually doing something about it, it relieves a lot of that angst, first
Mhm.
of all. So, and I think a lot of the relief of the angst is likelier to come in these offline like conversations, like these in-person conversations. So it gets to like one of these common questions that you can have in person, which is how do you like have a discussion with somebody where you don't agree on basic facts?
Yeah, that's obviously tough. I think, and first I just want to throw out like I'm a huge fan of your work and also other people like Isaac Saul's Tangle News. I
Hmm.
think you and Isaac and other people have been examples of people trying to do something concrete to tackle these issues. So I just want to say I think that's great. I think part of the solution is just getting more people to do these various projects and endeavors of various sorts to tackle it. Yeah, not agreeing on basic facts is obviously really hard, which is kind of the, in some sense, a big part of our divergent narratives in the first place. Like the polarization results in us not agreeing on a lot of basic facts because our narratives are so divergent. I think obviously, there's only so much you can do in those spots, but I do think getting back to the idea that there I'll try, even if you can't agree on some basic facts, can you try to understand how they've come to those views, and can you, even if you can't convince them on specific facts, can you at least, if you're trying to persuade them, trying to have a nuanced argument, can you at least help them see, if you can understand their view, maybe you can help them see what your concerns are. I think a big part of that is even just understanding the basic underlying things that they're concerned about, whether it's and often they may have real things, not just fake things that those concerns are based on, right? It's not as
Hmm.
if, like, usually for the most part, people's concerns are not entirely built on false things, even though we often
Hmm.
see them as like, we'll focus on like, well, they must be idiots, like they believe XYZ that is
Hmm.
false. But it's like
Hmm.
a lot of times they have other things that are real in those areas that their
Hmm.
concerns are built on, right? So I think
Hmm.
focusing on as much as you can on the things that you can agree with or can understand
Hmm.
about their concerns, right? And not
Yeah.
so much on like, if you can't convince them on XYZ specific facts or something. Yeah.
Yeah, when I can think of a couple of examples on the left and the right that maybe have like different factual underpinnings and understandings. Let me give you an example. If people on the right raising concerns about immigration, like like too many immigrants coming across the southern border and like crimes committed by those immigrants.
Mhm.
And I'll find that folks on the left will tend to dismiss those concerns, even though there are some factual underpinnings. And
Mhm.
like the disagreement on the extent of the problem often has a lot to do with the media sources you consume and like how much you think it is a problem. If you know, just MSNBC versus Fox News will present different statistics to users that might be true, but will to MSNBC viewers it just might not seem like that big of a problem, whereas to Fox viewers, it seems like a much of a big problem. And to get to an ultimate, like, all right, you and I, we decided to talk about this issue of immigration, and we agree exactly this many immigrants came over and this many crimes or whatever. It's really hard to get to. And then,
Yeah.
like a flip side example is, you know, Democrats talking about women being in danger, their lives being in danger because of lack of access to abortions,
Mm.
and like telling stories of women who, you know, had medical emergencies or died because of them. That's the same thing where like folks on the right might dismiss that, like, it doesn't really happen that much, and because like the again the same kind of factual underpinnings of like the rate at which it happens or whatever, it's sort of hard to like, all right, we're gonna go sit down, we're gonna go do a bunch of research together from like factual sources and find out the exact number. Finding the underlying concern there, like, look, and acknowledging that somebody else has a valid concern.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, so like don't just dismiss because you don't think it happens that much on one side or the other. Like
Right.
dismissing those facts can be as big of a problem as like not agreeing on the facts.
Yeah, no, I think that's a hugely important point, and I actually that's probably the thing I would emphasize more in my book if I was going to go back. I think that the fact that it's just so easy for humans to build entirely different narratives of harm, like who's doing harm, right? Like, for example, like the immigration crime thing, right? Like, clearly some, illegal immigrants do commit crime, uh, even murder, right? And like that can be scary. Like that can build a logical, defensible narrative in the same way that, like, to make an analogy, the left is angry about shootings, killings by police, even if, as conservatives might think, in context, that's not as big a deal as you're making it out to be. So just to say, we can build all sorts of narratives depending, because harm is harm, right? Like if we perceive harm,
Mhm.
that even if it's a little bit of harm, we can say like this is too much harm, right? Like the idea of what harm is normal and expected is entirely subjective depending on like where we, oftentimes where we want, where we're kind of our attention is drawn and where our, sometimes even where our allegiances are, what we pay attention to, et cetera. So it's just to say I just think it's very important to see that harm can be, perceptions of harm can be very subjective, and I think like you're saying, it's very good to, for people that want to tone down the contempt, it's acknowledging like, yes, it's possible for liberals to see why the perspective that even one, even a few too many crimes or murders is too much if we believe that those people shouldn't have been in the country in the first place, right? Like that's how they frame it, and like each side has their narratives of why harm is excessive or why it's okay in context, right? Like,
Hmm.
I think that's very important to see, and it's getting to that central idea, which, I was quoted from Kevin Dorst, who's done some good work in examining the rational ways that we can reach polarized perspectives. And, it's not, I think we have a tendency to be like, look at how stupid these people's perspectives are, right? But I like, if we care about reducing contempt, it's worth examining the very rational ways that we can pick and choose information to build
Hmm.
those narratives. And those narratives aren't, even if we disagree with them, we can see the shreds of rationality in there. Yeah.
Hmm. I am gonna take one like a voice question. So Joy Thomas, if you want to get ready, you've been patiently waiting with your hand up. I just want to be cognizant if there's any issues like getting your question into the chat. I know we're not always going to get that question, but I'm going to allow you to talk here in a second if you're there. Joy, you want to go ahead and say your question? I might have left her on mute for too long.
Oh,
All right. You have to you'd have to unmute Joy. All right.
looks like she's unmuted.
Oh, there you are, Joy.
Oh,
We can't hear you. All right. Sorry, I tried. All right. Anne also it had her her hand up. So I'm gonna and you put in the chat that you're part of Braver Angels, a great organization. Really, Zach and I are both familiar with it. You want to share?
Yes, so I just want to give a plug to Braver Angels. It has been
Hmm.
um so I want to start off by saying I never go on social media just for the reasons that you all have said. I can't find anything that makes me feel good there. So I prefer a face-to-face discussion. And so we have a small group. I'm from Longmont, Colorado. We have a
Hey.
small group of 8 people. One of the rules is that the group has to be balanced. So there are 4 reds and 4 blues who come. And we give time, we give dedicated time to each person to express their beliefs about whatever topic we've chosen. We're actually, our topic in a couple of weeks is Project 2025. So everybody's encouraged to read it, find something in there that touches them and just bring it forward, not to defend it, not to put it down, just to bring it forward. And then each of us has a chance to comment on that. And so after we make a comment, then when that's limited to, I think I'm going to do 4 minutes, then there'll be 2 minutes of questions from everybody else. So it's safe. There are guardrails on the conversation, and I find it very hopeful and
Hmm.
helpful. So
Mhm. Yeah,
that's
I
what
do think
Yeah.
getting involved in Braver Angels or checking out what Starts With Us is doing, or even to pitch my own stuff, buying and promoting my books. If you like my books, that's I think there's all these different ways, but I think checking out Braver Angels, I love what they do. I was going to throw all that stuff in there for people who wanted to know more about what like concrete things they could do. Yeah.
right.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And there, yeah, let's talk about like things we can actually do. I'm uh, gonna turn to that. The one of the big takeaways I have like I've gotten from doing this kind of work and engaging with folks is that the kind of work that that we're doing is sort of it's not widespread, and it's hard to scale like the conversations where there's like these rules of engagement. Not everybody is an analyst for Ad Fontes Media and has like these really respectful conversations. A lot of the times it's like you going out in the wild, especially with these online conversations, you can feel like you're getting beat up and you're like the only person that's like trying to talk in a sane way. So yes, I let me give the big plug for your books. They're excellent. How Contempt Destroys Democracy, and Diffusing American Anger on Zach Elwood's website. You can Google it. They're really easy to find. Good reads, and they specifically have a lot of links to other books and academic work in this field. What else do you want to add to close this out?
Yeah, I think to me, I see, there's often a debate about whether making systemic changes are the most important thing to reduce toxic polarization, or cultural change, convincing more people of the importance of this. And I focused on convincing, the cultural change aspect because I think we just need more and more people talking about it, and more demand for it if we're going to change something bigger, right? Because I just think sometimes the systemic change talk avoids the fact that we are so polarized that probably making systemic changes would be really hard. So I think we just need more demand amongst the population for these things, which is kind of what I focus on. And I think we need, not to say we just need my book, but I think we need more resources that are persuasive to convince people of the importance of this work. And that's what I focused on with my book. I'm trying to make something that's short but persuasive, and that people can share with other people, whether it's my book or other resources. I just think we need more people to spread the word, and to have those tough conversations where and even to say, I know that you're politically passionate, but here's why I think you should care about these ideas, and not see them as something opposed to your ideas. But yeah, I think just spreading the word is important, and hopefully people, if we did spark some curiosity about these ideas for people that were previously skeptical, I just hope that they'll look into it a little bit more and answer some of the objections. Yeah.
I think the crux of this work is really summed up in Martin Luther Jr. King quote that somebody dropped in the chat about how hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. That's exactly the point here. So thank you so much for joining. The hour flew by. Really love talking about this with you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you everyone online. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Bye.
That was a talk I had with Vanessa Otero of Adfonsis Media. This has been the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zachary Elwood. You can learn more about this podcast at peoplewhoreadpeople.com. Thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.